Now we move to our next speaker, Mr. Josh Williams. Mr. Williams was formerly Chief Executive of the Industry Training Federation of New Zealand and a Senior Manager in Tertiary Education Policy at the New Zealand Ministry of Education. Earlier, Mr. Williams was part of the team at the New Zealand Qualifications Authority that developed New Zealand's evaluative system of quality assurance for the non-university sector. He will be talking today about e-quality, how digital technology is supporting quality and consistency in VET. We invite Mr. Josh Williams to the floor.
Thank you, Excellencies. Assalamu alaikum, greetings. It's a pleasure to spend some time with you in the very early hours of the morning here in New Zealand. As Excellency says, my brief for you today is to discuss, I think, what Mr. Katayamu was talking about in terms of some of the new trends that we are seeing with digital assessment, the capturing of informal learning, but in particular, how we in New Zealand have taken a journey over the last decade or so in moving towards a more evaluative system for quality assurance. And in particular, in the COVID crisis that we all face today, how digital technologies are supporting and allowing some of that quality assurance to take place in some quite encouraging ways. So I will just share my screen. Thank you very much, and I hope that's coming through for everybody. So as I've mentioned, I will just need to, I think, just contextualize a little bit about the approach that we've taken here, just to, I guess, contextualize some of the shifts that I want to talk about. So I think, like a lot of countries, you know, the 150 developing qualifications frameworks were obviously interested always in the consistency that happens in respect of that, both the quality of our TVET providers, but also the quality and consistency of assessment, especially when it comes to meeting industry standards. And so it was around 10 years ago that here we moved from what was previously a very audit-based approach of government evaluating the inputs to a much more evaluative approach, focused on the final two bullet points on the slide, a continuous expectation that our TVET providers self-assess in respect of how well they were delivering education, meeting the needs of their students, meeting the needs of their stakeholders, and to triangulate that self-assessment evidence with a periodic external evaluation conducted by our qualifications authority. And I just really want to reinforce, because we certainly needed to reinforce it here, that self-assessment doesn't mean that we are not arm's length in terms of quality, and that actually what we are trying to instill in providers is a consistent approach and a culture change, which is about always investigating within an organization, across the organization, how well are we doing, and are we meeting the needs, and are we achieving the outcomes that we're setting to achieve. And I'd like to run for you something that, as Excellency mentioned, I was involved from the government side at the time. And this was a big shift in our system away from thinking about inspectorates and audits and towards a system of trying to instill a culture of self-assessment. And this is the way I liked to describe it then, and it's the way I still like to describe it. So we have people coming from the agency to check, and that's an evaluative threat. It's someone is coming. It's scary, and there's a professionally confident way to approach that as a value-adding process, to learn new things, to be surprised by something that you might not have seen in your own organization. But, you know, the way I described it was, you know, that the people from our qualifications authority were going to come along to your provider and ask you what we have in terms of 6 key evaluation questions for our providers. And I won't read them all, but how well do our students achieve? What is the value of the outcomes? How do our learning and assessment activities match the needs of those students and relevant stakeholders? And how effectively are students being supported? How effective is the governance and management? And in the end, I think because it's public money, government money, how effectively are the important compliances being managed? But for me, it was always really important to say, well, look, just imagine that no one is coming to check, and you were still this provider, and you still had this job in our TVET system around delivering these skills and outcomes and training. What would you ask yourself? And it turns out, of course, that it's exactly the same questions. Within an organization, you want to know how well your students are achieving. What is the value of the outcomes for your stakeholders? And so for us, this was a really important point around changing the mindset from our providers who were thinking they were being audited or externally inspected to having an evaluative conversation to discuss how well things were going. Yes, with the agency that had some responsibilities for managing consistency, but more that so we instilled a real quality culture within all of our TVET providers across New Zealand that were delivering vocational education and training. I also just like to give this slightly light-hearted example. If I'm in the dentist's chair and the dentist asks me, how often do I floss? The answer is once a day. The real answer is when I remember. And I think it's really important when we think about the difference between external review and self-assessment, that the real truth is, of course, what you know to be true for yourself, that I floss when I remember. But when the dentist asks me, I might give quite a different answer. So I think for any quality assurance system in education and training, the notion that an external inspector comes in and always gets the very truthful answer about what is actually happening within all of the layers of that organization, that's, it's not necessarily the truth. So this is why I think that self-assessment process is very, very important. It's the primary feature of the system. And as I say, I want to get on to why digital technologies is helping that conversation to be more meaningful. So, for us, good self-assessment was about embedding the quality processes in and across organizations, that everybody has a responsibility and a role to play in that, to define the outcomes and understand about the quality of the products and the services and the leadership that were being delivered within the organization. And that we really wanted evidence-driven organizations, that we did want to be data-driven and make sure that people really knew what was being achieved out there for important stakeholders, particularly the labour market stakeholders, given that vocational education is ultimately about a step up for an individual with respect to the labour market, getting a job, getting a better job, changing jobs. But unless there's a good outcome with respect to an employer, in what sense was it really vocational education and training? And we also saw plenty of examples, and we still do, of what's not so good in terms of that self-assessment process. And I've touched on a couple of these points. When quality is externalized from the organization or just seen as something that the government does to you, that it's something to think about every 3 to 5 years when someone is coming, or in a sort of a mediocre sense when quality matters within tertiary providers are seen as a matter for a person who is called the quality assurance manager, and they're in an office over there and they have all of the policies that nobody else reads or has much to do with. And as I say, what we saw was, that evaluative threat of the qualifications authority coming along to check, which, yes, that's what's occurring, but what are the quality processes that were underpinning that? So at this point, I want to kind of move to the core and fast forward to today, and just, I think, to pick up on some of the new trends, both in terms of how organizations are using digital technologies to manage quality themselves, but also I want to move to talk about how the external evaluation process is also being supported through digital and remote evaluations necessitated, as I say, by the COVID period and the associated lockdowns. So I think, you know, many of these factors will be familiar to viewers and are happening in a lot of systems around the world. But first and foremost, these things, our devices, are certainly making the world of assessment, particularly workplace-based assessment and on-job assessment, rather different. We're no longer separately writing about the skills that are being demonstrated or developed on the job. We are able to deliver content directly to those work sites via those devices, but we are also able to capture evidence of skills development, authenticate that via employers or assessors, and automatically upload these the skill development for the purposes of credentialization. That's helping obviously with centralized assessment of digital evidence. So that can again be made more consistent through a more centralized approach using digital technologies. That I think is becoming quite an important convergence, particularly for our employers, and particularly in terms of the question that's been raised in this session already, about the capturing of informal learning for the purposes of portability and credentialization for a career change or for redeployment or for recognition of experience or current competencies or prior learning, such that skills that have been gained in some way throughout a career can be captured for that purpose of formalizing that learning. And I think the final point that I'd really make, just in terms of that digital, the rise of these digital technologies, is that I see something of a convergence of what we've always described as learning management systems and the way that we collect information about learners into a way that, in fact, that combines with an e-portfolio to become something that's direct evidence of skill. So whereas once the best we could do was a certificate, a piece of paper with a seal on it and a logo and a signature, and that was your proxy for skill. Now we're able, through the use of digital technology, to deliver direct evidence of that skill through a learning management system and an electronic portfolio coming together. And I think that's going to be a really important conversation for the future of qualifications. So we are leading to direct observation of skills, again, which supports consistency management processes and the capturing of informal learning, which I think, again, with all of the future of work debates, the automation, Industry 4.0, the augmentation and stackability of skills over lifelong learning is something that I think all countries need to take very seriously now. I want to turn quickly to the external evaluation and review processes that I mentioned before. And I'm supported in this by some conversations I have had recently in preparation for this conference with people currently in our qualifications authority who have recently undertaken external reviews of some of our TVET providers, just like we are right now over Zoom. And what's been really interesting—
3 minutes more.
Certainly. What's interesting about that is that while it still remains something like an audit process where the evaluators are coming to check, the remote and virtual external evaluation means that it can be a more layered and iterative process. It's not bound by a particular couple of days that the evaluators are coming. And not just that, it even does take away, it seems, some of that external threat of let's go and get all the policies and show them all the paperwork on the table, because no one is actually physically coming along to look at that stuff. It really is about a conversation from the evaluators to say, what matters to you? What are your focus areas? What do you think is going well? What do you think is going less well? And so it really is about that learning conversation, and something that ought to be a evaluating process rather than a threatening process for that provider. So look, I'll end on this slide, and literally, I won't read this, but just in the case that it proves useful to a viewer or any other participant in the conference, one of the things when we developed this system that we heard over and over again was just give us a checklist. And the fact that they were asking that question told us that they hadn't necessarily made the thinking shift. They wanted a tick box process of an audit, whereas actually what we wanted to do was to have them really reflect and explore and look at the data and get underneath what were the outcomes and how well they were doing. So I will just leave this on the screen as one of the reports that was prepared at the time, that, you know, if someone is looking for a checklist around how to be evaluative within their own TVET organization as a provider, to know in their own minds that they're doing a good job, this is a pretty good checklist. So look, thank you again. It's been a pleasure to participate in ETAC conference. And so, Excellency, I hand the floor back now.
Thank you, Mr. Williams, for this insightful presentation. It's really interesting to look at the self-assessment as you describe it, and how people you may misclassify or don't report correctly the information, and digital assessment. Do you see a link between self-assessment and digital assessment? Is there now availability of cross-check with other data or sources that can tell the regulators that things are not in the right direction or something suspicious?
Yeah, look, I can speak on behalf of our training organizations, which are industry-led organizations, and they are tasked with managing national consistency. And of course, we are a small country, but we have employers and workplaces of all shapes and sizes up and down the country. And so I think where digital assessment is really helping here is in terms of both the online delivery, particularly of work-based learning, that we can be collecting that evidence in a more centralized way, so that we in turn can be telling the regulators about whether or not industry standards are truly being met. So I think the answer is yes. We're less reliant on people moving around, checking in different regions and different employers. And we are actually able to see in a more of a big data way, or at least a medium data way, whether or not actually standards are genuinely being met to maintain standards across an industry.